Good evening, everybody. Why don't we go ahead and put the slides up? I want to welcome everyone to our update about neuromuscular fellowship application reform. And I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy evenings to join us tonight. There's going to be time for questions, as Lucy mentioned, and you can enter those into the Q&A. We'll get to the questions at the end, but of course you can enter your questions at any time. So as she said, I'm Zach London, and my role here, and the reason I'm the one speaking to you tonight, is as the chair of the AAN's Fellowship Application Timeline Workgroup, which is a subset of the Graduate Education Subcommittee. This meeting, as you can see, is being hosted by the AAN. We have this beautiful AAN slide templates that we're using, but a lot of what we're going to be discussing tonight was formulated by a broader discussion group that's shown here on the next slide. We have representation from our work group that I'm a part of, that I mentioned before, as well as Gordon Smith, who is the chair of education for the AAN. We have representation from the AAN Neuromuscular section, from the AANEM Board of Directors, several neuromuscular fellowship directors who I think really were instrumental in helping us reframe and refine our recommendations, and an incoming neuromuscular fellow. All the people on this list have been absolutely crucial in developing the strategies that we're going to be outlining tonight. And I want to thank them in advance for their help. So let's go to the next slide. And what we're looking at here is the overview of what we're going to do. And I want to start right off the bat with telling you what the recommendations are going to be from our group. Then you'll at least know the basics of the what. And then we're going to get some time to spend going over the why and the how. And we'll come back to the recommendations again in more detail. But I wanted to get them out of the way early in case there's anybody that has, prior engagements, but also get back to them again for the people that roll in late. And then we're going to spend some time going over what I think are the questions that have come up the most to us, to our work group in the last several weeks, in terms of implementation and things that people have had some concerns about. And then finally, there will be a call to action in the end. And I think hopefully by that point, we'll all be closer to a consensus about how to move forward. So let's go ahead to the next slide. So our recommendations are pertaining to this year's recruitment season. So we are asking that for interviews for recruitment that is for fellows that will be beginning in July of 2022, that we delay fellowship application review until March 1st of 2021. So this aligns with the original AAN position statement that I think most of you have seen. The next is that programs can offer available positions to candidates no sooner than June 1st of 2021. So this date now differs from the original AAN position statement, which recommended August 1st. And we're going to spend some time talking about how our discussion group came up with this new date, why we're recommending that. Applicants will be given 48 hours to accept a position, meaning that you as a PD can give a candidate 48 hours or longer to make a decision starting June 1st. But you can't force them to decide before that time. And again, 48 hours seems like a short time, but we'll discuss the rationale for that later as well. There's going to be an updated list of participating and non-participating programs that'll be provided starting on or about August 1st and at regular intervals. And it's going to go to all neurology and PM&R residents, program directors, fellowship directors, and chairs. And we'll also talk about the form this might take and how it'll be disseminated. And then that there's going to be an independent panel of volunteers that will adjudicate suspected violations by programs. So that's the nutshell. If we go to the next slide, we're now going to back up and talk about how we got to these recommendations. This has been a process that has been going on for over 2 years. And I think transparency about this process and how we got here is very important for us to move forward. And I want to start on the next slide by looking at the current timeline for different neurologic specialties. So neurology fellowships, as you know, are just all over the map in terms of when we're allowed to submit applications or when we're expected to submit applications as candidates, when those candidates are interviewed and when offers are made, and whether there's a match or not. And those without a match, and particularly neuromuscular, clinical neurophysiology, and epilepsy, have been, creeping earlier and earlier every year over the last decade. And, we don't know exactly why this is, but I think most of us believe that it is because the reality is that in these fields, it's still a buyer's market, meaning there are a lot of fellowship positions and maybe not as many qualified candidates, and therefore program directors are incentivized to try to lock down candidates early. And what that ends up meaning is that they start interviewing earlier, making offers earlier, giving candidates an abbreviated time to make decisions, and effectively preventing them from potentially interviewing other places. Thus, residents in our field are often being forced to submit applications as early as August of their PGY3 year. And the fine print at the top of the slide says that's PGY3 for adult neurology residents, or PM&R residents for child neurology residents, or NDD residents. That would be a year later. If I say a PGY level, assume I'm talking about adult and just add a year. Most of us recognize that this is really early. To ask residents who are just coming out of PGY 2 year to try to make an informed decision about what fellowship they want to go into and where they want to go, to declare for a subspecialty, essentially when they've just come out of a year that in many programs is almost entirely inpatient. And here we are as an outpatient field, and a lot of residents don't have that exposure significantly before they're trying to make that decision. So this is how we compare to other fields in neurology. Next slide, let's see how we compare to other fields in medicine. This is the timeline for fields outside of neurology. I stratified them by sort of early and middle and late. So the earliest of all of these fields on this list is orthopedics, and theirs is sort of comparable to ours in so much as applicants are submitting their applications as early as August of their penultimate year of residency, kind of like what we're seeing in our field. The difference is, of course, ortho is a much longer residency. So they've had 3 or 4 years of orthopedic surgery or more by the time they're making that decision. As opposed to in neuromuscular, where residents are, in the process of 3 years of neurology, and they're only a third of the way through that when they're trying to make a decision. Take a look at internal medicine towards the bottom. Now, they have a match, they use ERS, and they don't accept applications for review until August of the final year, so a full year later than what we're doing. And they have a match in December of their final year, which give candidates about a little over 6 months to get their licensure in order, and move and do whatever else is they need to do. Psychiatry is even later, and this is something I just learned, that they don't actually have their offers until January. The other thing, of course, to note on this page is the final column, which is that every single one of these fields has a match. There are other fields in medicine that don't have a match, a lot of surgical subspecialties, and some of them are actually all over the map, kind of like neurology is too. Okay, so next slide here. So we've been exploring how our various stakeholders feel about neurology's application timeline, not just neuromuscular, but neurology. And not surprisingly, residents and program directors generally don't really like it. They think it's too early. So every 10 years, the American Academy of Neurology puts out a resident survey and a program director / fellowship director survey. And in the 2017 surveys, there were questions about fellowship timing. Do you think the fellowship timing is good or bad? Is it a problem? Is it too early? And the majority of both program directors and residents said, yeah, it is too early. We need to push it later. Most of them, if they gave comments, said it should be at least in the second half of PGY 3 year or later. Some said later than that. To follow up on this and to get a little bit more detail about these opinions, the Consortium of Neurology Program Directors did a survey of their constituents in late 2018, asking about the timeline and about specific dates. And 97% were on board with a March start date for the interview cycle, and a smaller majority favored the August date for offers, although there was a lot more disagreement about that. And again, this is not specifically for neuromuscular, this is for all fields that we were asking. So next slide, this led to the American Academy of Neurology developing a position statement, and that was originally developed in January of 2019 when Ralph Sacco was president. And it recommended those dates, March 1st for applications and August 1st for offers. So this was then sent out for endorsement to various neurologic organizations and subspecialties. And the bolded organizations here were among the ones that endorsed it. The AANEM did not specifically endorse the timeline. They wrote back a very thoughtful letter that said, hey, we like this in theory, but we'd like to get more detail about how it's going to be operationalized, and said that they would work with the AAN to develop such a plan. So next slide, I think then we sort of developed our fellowship application timeline work group. So that's the work group that I'm speaking to on behalf of today. We were sort of put together to help figure out how to move this process forward. And the AAN position statement was finalized and distributed to all members in January of this year. But throughout 2019 and 2020, representatives of our group and of the Graduate Education Subcommittee attended specialty meetings, including the ANEM, including the AES, including ANA, and many others, to try to promote the standardized timeline. And I think based on those meetings, we felt that it was too much of a lift to try to get every specialty on board at the same time. It didn't seem realistic. Some fields, I think, have idiosyncratic reasons for needing their timelines to be certain ways. And we can talk about what those are for different fields, but I think the point was not everybody was ready to be on board at once. And some fields like neuromuscular, I think, were really hungry for change. And other fields, like epilepsy, for instance, actually weren't quite there yet in those discussions. So we eventually decided to pilot an initiative with 3 fellowship programs that we felt were had demonstrated the most enthusiasm for application timeline reform. And that's neuromuscular and headache and movement disorders. So on April 23rd of this year, the Academy sent a letter from President Jim Stevens to all the program directors of all these programs, as well as chairs and core program directors, asking them to commit to the March 1st and August 1st timeline. So we were doing what we were internally calling a Kickstarter initiative. I don't know how many of you have ever used Kickstarter, but it's basically, it's when you try to raise capital for a project with the promise that nobody has to pay a penny unless you sort of meet a bare minimum necessary to fund the project to get it off the ground. So we were thinking the same thing, and we were asking programs to commit to the timeline, but no one would be held to that commitment unless we could get 85% of programs to agree. So why 85%? Well, honestly, it was a committee decision, and it was chosen because, of course, 100% is what we want. That is ideal. The problem with 100% is then you can have one lone or maverick fellowship director who doesn't like the idea, who could sabotage the process for everybody. So we picked 85% because honestly, it just felt like a high enough number that it would allow people to feel comfortable, but that it might be attainable. So next slide here. So the response to that letter and the request that went with it. So there were 54 neuromuscular programs that we reached out to. The response was 44 out of those 54, which in and of itself is already less than the 85%. Those that responded, 42 out of the 44 said, yes, we would be happy to agree to this timeline, but we didn't make the 85% because a lot of people didn't respond. And I think that lack of response doesn't represent people not reading their email. I think these are people that had honest concerns about what we're asking them to do. And in conversations with many of those people, it seemed like while there was near universal support for a later timeline, there was a significant minority who had concerns about the process and the transparency of the process and the implementation that was outlined in the AAN letter. So next slide, that is why we convened this work group. I think it became clear that we needed to engage more stakeholders rather than just members of the GES. And I think, this group was extremely innovative. And the first thing that came out of these meetings was the idea of trying to have a directed survey to fellowship directors to get a sense of what they liked and didn't like about application timeline reform, and identify, barriers to implementation. Next slide. So that really brings us up to today. So, throughout June, we were sending out that survey, we were getting those survey results, and that survey was sort of informing the discussions that our group was having and that we're bringing to you today. The other dates on this timeline were also outlined in that original letter. July 21st would be our proposed date by which we would want to get all participants who are going to participate in this timeline on board, such that on August 1st, the Academy could essentially release the final recommendations and list of programs that are participating. So what this means is we have a little less than a month to get as many fellowships as possible online and on board with these recommendations. All right, so let's talk about on the next slide what we learned from that survey. And I'm not going to present all of the data. Of course, I'm happy to make all of that publicly available, but I really want to basically divide this up into two categories. There were things that there was a consensus about and things that there were not quite a consensus about. So the things that more than 90% of neuromuscular fellowship directors seem to agree on is that everybody thinks change is necessary, change is possible. We didn't think applicants should be limited in the number of programs that they apply to, and we're all worried about other programs not playing fair. I think we all know how important it is for our programs to fill, and we just want to make sure our competitors can't find a way around it or find a way to get away with getting around it. Next slide. The things that we did not have a consensus about are listed here. So these are really important questions. Should we just have a match? So of those surveyed, 38% said yes, 29% said no, the rest were neutral. We're going to come back to this. This is an important question and one that I think is absolutely fundamental to what we're talking about today. But I just wanted to point out that about a third of people felt one way and about a third of people felt the other way. Should we make sure that epilepsy and CNP are on board with the same timeline from the beginning? And again, a significant minority of people said, yeah, I think that's pretty important. And the majority said it's probably okay if they're not. But I think, again, this is a really important topic that we can't gloss over because this has the potential to impact how we move forward. There were some people who said they wouldn't participate unless we could get 100% participation, which, as I've already said, I think is challenging, but not impossible. And then there was also a minority of folks who felt that there were problems with the specific dates, either the March 1st for application review or the August 1st for offers. And most of them really had a problem with the long time between them. Why do we have to wait all the way till August? 5 months seems like a long time. So I think those really informed our detailed recommendations, which we'll go over here on the next slide. I mean, our discussion group really decided, let's focus on, and we can go to the next slide again here. We can focus on what are the things we can control, what are the things that we have a consensus about, and have a plan for the things that we don't have a consensus about, a plan for how to move forward in building consensus about those things, if not now, then within the foreseeable future. So let's go over those recommendations in a little bit more detail here. Applications would be available for review no sooner than March 1st, 2021. So that means that interviews can be offered anytime after that. And again, to clarify, you can't review applications in December and say, okay, I'll interview on March 1st. March 1st is the day that you are allowed to distribute offers to your candidates. And then, of course, interviews can start anytime after that. And next slide, the expectation would be that most interviews would now take place in March and April and May, sort of creating this nice little 3-month interview season that we would all be doing at about the same time. But of course, there'd be no mandatory end date for interviews. You could continue to offer interviews as late as you want until your program is filled. And then programs can begin to make offers no sooner than June, so June 1st. Obviously, we would expect that people would only make the number of offers for positions they have. So if you've got 2 positions, you would say, you can make 2 offers. And if somebody were to turn one of those down, you could replace that and make an offer to the next person on your list. Then applicants would be given 48 hours to accept that position. And it says a minimum of 48 hours. And just to clarify, they will be given 48 hours or more in which to come back to you with an answer. So you couldn't say you have to get back to me within an hour. You could say you have 2 days, or you could say you have a week. You could make whatever number you want as long as that number is 2 days or longer to get back to you. And our thinking was that 48 hours is short, right? I mean, this is one of the concerns that some of our fellowship candidates have had in the past is they've gone on interviews and they've been told like, okay, get back to us within 48 hours. But that is when you haven't finished your interviews yet. if you have 3 months to complete your interviews, the idea should be that by June 1st, as a candidate, you feel comfortable knowing what it is that you want to do and where you want to go. So when the offers come in, you should be ready to make a decision. And if a candidate does not respond within 48 hours or however long they're given, it would be considered a rejection. But of course, again, the program may still choose to extend that time if they so decide, and there would be no official end time for offers either. I also wanted to quickly bring up one of the questions that's come up a couple of times is, what about internal candidates? And I think it's common practice to kind of settle things with internal candidates, under the table. I think we believe that internal candidates deserve the same due as everybody else, at least in so much as they should be given the leeway to explore all of the programs that they want to interview at. Thus, any under-the-table offers to internal candidates should still allow them until at least June 1st, or I guess I would say June 3rd, which would be 48 hours after June 1st, in which to make a decision, because I think it's really important to give them that time. I feel like internal candidates would be more likely to potentially feel pressured or even bullied into accepting a position just because they're still working with these people for the next 2 years. So I think that's something we can delve into in more detail later, but let's move on to the next slide and talk about participation. So as I mentioned before, programs are going to be asked to commit to participate by July 21st, a little bit less than a month from now. That's a Tuesday, I just looked that up. So programs that have already agreed to commit to the timeline that we asked about in April will sort of be considered to be participating, but of course can change their participation status at any time. And the one thing that's going to be different about how we process these requests compared to the ones we sent in April is we're going to make sure that there is transparency about what other programs, specifically what other programs have responded. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask, we're going to basically have essentially a Google Sheet probably, where people who are fellowship directors are entitled to, the ones entitled to make the decision can also go on and see what other programs have agreed to participate. So you can make sure that you and your competitor programs all sort of, handshake and get in on the list. Participating programs will be asked probably to have some language on their own internal websites talking about the fact that they're agreeing to abide by this timeline. I think that's important in case anybody gets there by Google and is just trying to learn about how programs have their application timeline. All right, next slide. Now, this is an important discussion that we have. The role of the AAN. I was a little naive about this, I think, when we first started. And I think from reading some of the questions that had been submitted, I think some of you should have shared my worldview about this, which is, can the AAN just say, yes, this is the way it has to be? The Academy is not in the business of mandating things. The Academy doesn't have the authority to force anybody to abide by a timeline or adjudicate violations. That's not their role. And people have asked, well, what about the ACGME? Can we get the ACGME involved and threaten accreditation for programs that don't abide by the timeline? And they are also not in the business of policing fellowship timing timelines. There are no programs in all of medicine in which program accreditation depends on abiding by a certain timeline. They leave it up to the specialty organizations. And I can't speak for the AANEM. I can tell you that we have members of the AANEM board in our discussion group, and we are actively talking to the AANEM about if they want to take a larger role in this process, but I also think that we can't promise that today either, because they may view this the same way as the American Academy of Neurology does. What the AAN is willing to do is share our list of participating programs and non-participating programs. And sharing them, we will, and that will be shared with all neurology and PM&R residents, fellowship directors, program directors, chairs, and we're planning to do that on or about August 1st of this year. I said on or about because, again, looking at the dates, I realized August 1st is a Saturday. So presumably it's going to be either the day before that or 2 days after that on August 3rd. And if there are changes to the list at any time, those will be shared with all the same stakeholders at regular intervals and or on a public website. And in terms of violations, we will inform residents through this communication that if they receive interviews before March 1st or offers before June 1st, they will have a means for reporting that concern. And this is something that our discussion group is working on the details of. But I think what we can promise is that there'll be an independent panel. And what we're hoping for is to have a panel of volunteers that would rotate, every year or two, that will include both members of our discussion group, volunteers from this community of fellowship directors, and probably some people even from outside of the neuromuscular world to sort of serve in an ombudsman role to investigate suspected violations. And again, whether this is something that the A&EM takes on or that our discussion group does with your help has yet to be determined. But we're going to make sure this is something we're very transparent about as we figure that out in the coming weeks. And then, of course, if a program is determined to be in violation, that information would also be shared with the same stakeholders. All right, next slide, please. So rationale for proposed dates. Okay, next slide. So why these dates? And I want to sort of frame this in terms of what are the benefits to residents and to programs and to really our whole field for having these dates. I think the benefits to the applicants, to the residents, are probably the clearest. It will allow residents the time they need to explore what neurology fields have to offer by way of subspecialties during residency. It'll give them time to do subspecialty rotations, to do, to do their EMG rotations, to do neuromuscular rotations, to get letters of recommendation from faculty who actually have worked with them and know them well from those fields, maybe to even do research in those fields to boost their applications. And it'll eliminate the anxiety that they get from this timeline creep where they feel the need to apply earlier and earlier. I mean, I've heard of CNP applicants telling me they had to have their application submitted on July 1st of their PGY3 year, which is, I think, incredibly stressful for them. And now the benefits to programs, I mean, we're talking about now having a candidate pool of residents who are better informed regarding their subspecialty of choice. And let me appeal to you as a group of neuromuscular people here. Residents are much more likely to have done those neuromuscular and those EMG rotations by March than they have by August of their PGY3 year. And it'll give them a chance to see how cool it is, right? And to fall in love with it naturally instead of just guessing what field to go into. And while the question hasn't come up often, I think I need to at least address, why don't we do this later? Like, we've been talking about why we're not doing it early. But I also, showed you examples of other fields of medicine that have their application process, August through December, even later of the final year. So I think there are reasons for that too. I mean, one is that we don't feel like it would be a great idea for PGY4 residents to be off doing interviews in July and August when you've got brand new PGY2s that need experienced seniors. But also we want to make sure that graduates have time to figure out their licensure in other states. And for international grads who are on J1 visas, that if they need a waiver, they need to get that information in usually by the mid-fall. So we picked these earlier dates to make sure that there was never a rush for any of those things. Why June 1st? So, I mean, this comes down to why have this waiting period between when you can first interview and when you can first offer. I think this is really important for candidates. They need to have the opportunity to explore and to vet all of the programs that they might be interested in and not feel like they are being forced to make a decision before they're ready. And I think when our discussion group met and we looked at the surveys and we looked at what other fields in medicine are doing, I think it became clear that 3 months for interviews is pretty much a standard timeline. Again, the AAN original recommendation was 5 months, March to August. And we didn't think that extending the offer date to August 1st conferred any additional benefit. And we were hoping that that would be more appealing to more program directors in terms of getting more people to come into the fold. And I think, of course, having that 3 months for programs also allows you as PDs to vet a larger cohort of fellowship candidates in their training program before making a decision. So you actually don't feel pressured to offer something to the first decent candidate you see and can actually get to meet all of your candidates and make an educated decision. And of course, waiting longer, I would argue, also lessens the chance that a fellow is going to change their mind after making a commitment to you. I mean, I think that's something we see a lot more than we'd like to, is that people decide that maybe they don't want to do neuromuscular after all, after applying, because now that they're farther into PGY3, they've actually finally gotten to see neuro-oncology or sleep, and they like that better. So the more time residents have, the more they're going to be committed to the field. And this is a huge benefit to the field of neurology. It'll allow the future neurologists to be more sure about what they want to do and to be in fields that they are a good fit for. And this has the potential to mitigate burnout in neurology, because they'll have made the right career choice for them. Okay, so that's kind of our rationale for those recommendations. So the next slide, this is where we get into the controversial things. I guess next slide after that too. No, never mind, go back. This is the only slide. The why neuromuscular medicine, I think there is no text on the slide other than me trying to answer this question. I want to take a few minutes because this is something that has been coming up in discussion a lot, which is, shouldn't we be trying to roll this out to all fields of neurology, or at least specifically epilepsy and CNP, which has some overlap with neuromuscular, and of course epilepsy, which has overlap with CNP, these overlapping candidate pools? This is a really good question. And I think the short answer is that we do want CNP and epilepsy. We want all fields of neurology to get on board with this and to do it now. And all of those fields, their subspecialty organizations and all of the representatives have seen the AAN position statement, and they've been talking about it. And our hope is that they're going to reach the same conclusion and independently decide to adopt these recommendations. The extra effort that we're putting into headache and neuromuscular and movement disorders, as I mentioned before, was because those were the groups that we really felt had shown a significant grassroots interest in moving forwards with this now. It's hard to imagine changing the timeline for CNP without changing the timeline for epilepsy also, right? When our representative spoke at the AES last year and the year before, we were just getting the sense that they weren't ready. Now, that may be changing. I think it's changing. I think there really is a groundswell of support for this. People are talking about it more, and we're really renewing our efforts to try to get CNP and epilepsy on board. But I really think we have to accept that postponing this decision for another year or two or more to wait for them to be ready is not a good strategy for us. I think the most effective strategy is to continue to work with them, but to prove to them that it can be done, to prove that we can get the vast majority of neuromuscular fellowship directors on board with this recommended timeline. And when they see the success that we've had, I think they're going to be much more willing to adopt the timeline as well. All right, next slide. Why now? And this really ties in with the why now. Because again, what's our rush? Why don't we wait another few years if we need to? Timeline creep has been going on for a long time. So next slide here, I think there is a slide with some text. Yeah, I mean, so, the pandemic has really, I think, forced our hand in many ways. Residents all over the country have been pulled from rotations, and many of them have been pulled from outpatient rotations to do inpatient service, or they've been pulled from outpatient rotations because those rotations ceased to exist for several months. EMG labs were closing, neuromuscular clinics were going all virtual. And, we're a field that relies on face-to-face, at least to get people excited about it. Physical examination is a huge part of what draws people to neuromuscular medicine. EMGs are a huge part of what draws people to neuromuscular medicine. So our residents coming into PGY3 have not, by and large, had those experiences. I predict that if we don't make a change this year, we're going to see, a significant drop-off in neuromuscular applicants, I think, for that reason. Now, most of us are going to be doing virtual interviews this year. Has lots of challenges for sure. I think that one of the silver linings of virtual interviews is that it's probably easier to schedule interviews than usual for the residents, at least in terms of not having to book travel time and things like that. So I think this 3-month interview period will prove to be more than adequate, especially at the virtual interview season. And then the last reason here, and I guess I really can't overemphasize this, is momentum. This is this is fresh in everybody's mind right now, right? There's been all this communication from the Academy, and program directors and fellowship directors are talking about this, and people are excited about having something that we can enact this year. If we lose that, we lose this momentum. And Neuromuscular is really in a unique position right now. We are poised to lead the way to prove that this can be done, and do the right thing for the trainees in our field. And I think it's really incumbent on us to figure out how to move forwards with that, how to reach enough of a consensus, and to do this in a way that's fair and a way that's transparent. All right, next slide. Match or no match, right? So again, there is no doubt that a match would solve a lot of the problems that we're talking about and a lot of the challenges that I think this plan is going to face. It would allow us to have a unified timeline. It would be self-enforcing in many ways. And I believe, as many of you do, that it's definitely worth considering. It's just, based on the survey results, we are not there as a community, not yet. As I mentioned before, about a third of respondents are interested in a match, slightly more than a third. And I have heard some very reasonable arguments against it as well, many of which are actually, in fact, I think, truly applicant-centric. And I think, again, our goal should be to be as applicant-centric as possible. Our work group, our discussion group's main goal is to facilitate something that will allow us to build consensus so that we can enact meaningful change now, this year, for the reasons that I talked about above. Not in 3 years. I think this is something that we need to try to figure out now. And if only a third of you want to match, I don't think we're going to be able to convince the other 2/3 within the next few weeks. But what we are proposing today is truly an iterative process. I mean, I really think that this is not the end of the game here. This is not the end of the line. This is the first step. This is getting us from bad to good. And I expect and I hope that we will continue to have conversations about the possibility of match throughout the year and next year and in years to come. And I think what we're going to learn this year will allow us to move the needle either towards or away from a match, depending on how things go. All right, next slide. Tools to support an application timeline. So can we develop tools that would support this application process? So on the next slide, I have sort of a few examples here. So I've kind of given the recommendations. Now what I want to go over is things that our discussion group has been talking about as ways to make this experience better for all of us. And some of these are things we can do right now, and some of them are more aspirational, but they are going to take some further discussion beyond what we're going to be able to decide tonight. But I want to bring this up because I want to get people thinking about this and talking about this. I mentioned before, Headache was one of the pilot programs, right? Headache, we went through the Kickstarter thing with them they only got about a 60% response rate. And so what the American Headache Society did is they just took matters into their own hands. Lucy, are we able to click on that top link where it says Headache Experience? And I guess we'll have to share the website. Maybe we can or we can't. I'll give you a second. If it doesn't work out, I can describe it.
I'm not able to click on it right now.
Okay, that's fine. So I would encourage all of you, if you get a chance, to go to the AHS website, the American Headache Society, and they have a page that's called National Headache Fellowship Opportunities. What is on that page is it's a very savvy and sexy looking page that essentially the first thing that it says is we are going to abide by the AAN's recommended timeline of March 1st / August 1st. They then have links to all the different fellowship programs with big pretty pictures. And when you click on a link, it has information about the program. It actually names the people that have matched into that program or are going into that program for like 2021, 21, 22. If they have openings, it'll list it there. And then there's a form where you can contact the program director directly. As of today, I think they have 24 programs, something like that. And it is a genuinely useful resource, and it's a centralized resource for applicants and programs alike, and it showcases the programs that have agreed to the recommended timeline. They don't explain how they're going to monitor compliance, but they do say that programs that don't abide by the timeline will be removed from the website. Now, something like this already exists for us. And I'm assuming if you can't open the first website, you can't open the second one, but the one that says A&EM fellowship listing, that's a link. Oh, good. Somebody put Amanda Guidam put the link to the AHS site in the chat window. And maybe somebody could do the same for the A&EM fellowship listing if you can find it, just so you can compare and contrast those. The A&EM site is, it's not as pretty, it doesn't have any pictures, but what it does do is it actually lists all the programs, both neuromuscular and CNP, and sort of lists like when they're accepting applications, which is incredibly disturbing to me to look at how early some of these programs are accepting applications and how some actually don't even list dates at all. There's such a wide variety. Anyway, so I think there are opportunities here for us to try to create or modify a tool that showcases programs that are agreeing to participate in the recommended timeline. Next slide. But our discussion group has also been talking about perhaps a more aspirational goal of employing an entire application management system. That's what I'm calling it. I think if you Google application management system, it actually might mean something different. It might mean like computer applications, but it's sort of a recruitment management system. And again, I want to thank Amanda Guidam and Carissa Gable and others who really put a lot of thought into what this ideal system would look like. It would basically be an application portal. It would allow everything that we talked about from the Headache website, plus a unified place where you could submit applications, letters of recommendation, letters of interest, and then a communication portal where programs and applicants could talk to each other, essentially replacing personal email, and therefore ensuring communications don't take place outside of the recommended timeline. It could be involved in scheduling interviews. It could be involved in making offers at the right time and retracting them at the right time. And then violation management wouldn't even be necessary because all the communication and offers would go through this system. So this sounds pretty great. It would probably be very expensive to make. And it would be great if, for instance, like the A&EM decided to take this on and help us with this, or if we were able to find an out-of-the-box software that already does this. It turns out there is, and we all know it already, which is ERAS, which I'll talk about in the next slide here. So ERAS, of course, as we know, is the application service that med students all use for residency. It's also used by most of the non-neurology fellowships that have a match. And as we've discovered, it does not actually require that you have a match. So you can actually, the NRMP is the match, ERAS is the application management system. It has all the features that pretty much that we were talking about, other than the making the offers part. And as I mentioned, there are fields like, I think addiction medicine is one that use ERAS for application management, but don't use it for a match. The problem is with ERAS is they actually are not flexible about their dates. They have a July application cycle and a December application cycle, and the December application cycle means people can look at applications in December through May 31st. Which, the back end of that is very much like our timeline, but the front end of that isn't. So we could explore the possibility of using ERAS, but just using our rule that, well, you can't look at applications until March 1st. I'm trying to set up a meeting with them to find out if this is possible or not, because I think it might be sort of something that would almost allow us to plug and play. Of course, the problem is they would close on May 31st, and so if you don't have all of your interviews done between March and June, then you wouldn't actually be able to get applications through the application management service after that. Again, I don't have enough information to, I think, present for you exactly what that would look like, but we're going to find out and we will get back to you about it. All right, finally, the last bullet point here is the SF match. Thanks to Erica Schuyler, who really did the heavy lifting figuring out how the SF match works. They have a very cool application management system that, again, does all the things that we would want. It's entirely flexible about the dates. Movement Disorders uses it. They use the dates of March through August. The problem with SF Match is that they are a match. They don't offer any of those services unless you're also doing a match, and that's not something they're willing to budge about. I would say if the time comes that we are ready to think about a match, we should look at SF Match. It looks like it would meet our needs very nicely. All right, so next slide. So this is where we now stand. We have recommendations, we have an application timeline, and how we're going to encourage participation and how we're going to enforce it. And again, we'll help provide language for participating programs to put on their program websites to say that they'll be abiding by the timeline. And I can't emphasize enough that this is the right thing to do for our field, for our trainees, and the time to do it is now. We really can't afford to lose this momentum, and we can't afford to lose another round of neuromuscular applicants because they haven't had a chance to explore our field yet. I think we've tried our best to be transparent about this process and to listen to the concerns that you have raised and at least have a plan to address them. And as one of our discussion group members said, we don't want perfection to be the enemy of good. I don't know if I'm quoting that exactly right. Raghav, you can correct me if I say that wrong. But I think that brings us to this call to action, which is on the last slide here. I'm asking us all to commit to the application timeline now. And we're also asking for some patience as we continue to explore some of the things that we think will take longer to finalize, but will make this experience even better for all the stakeholders. And that would include, either a more comprehensive website for fellowship opportunities or an application management system to support our applications, either run by the ANEM or IRAS or independently, an opportunity to let us keep working on CNP and epilepsy. I sincerely hope and believe it may even be possible to get them on board for this year, but it may not be. And if it's not, we have to prove to them that this can be done. And again, I believe once they see the success that we're having, they will definitely come to the table. And then I think finally, we need to continue to have conversations about the possibility of having a match. I'm gonna ask, I don't wanna say put off conversations about match for a year. I don't want you to put off those conversations. Let's have those conversations now. But if you're a proponent of the match, be willing to see how things go without it for a year and revisit the match once we're more informed by this experience. Okay, so that's all I had for the presentation. Next slide, I think, just says thank you. Yes, thank you. I do have a lot of people to thank, but I particularly want to thank my colleagues in the AN work group and our discussion group who really have been living and breathing this for the last 2 months. This is a really big lift, but it's important, and I know we can get there, and I think we now have some time for Q&A.
So Zach, you have one question in the Q&A section.
Yep. So I see that. Does this apply to international, exceptionally qualified candidates who are not part of the ACGME accredited program? That's a great question. That's not something that we had considered. And I don't think I understand the timeline for those applicants because I would imagine it would have something to do, because my understanding is that those exceptionally qualified candidates have to be approved by institutional GME committees. So I think we would have to take that into account when making any recommendations, because I certainly wouldn't think it would be our role to disqualify those candidates from participation because of having to go through GMX.
There's another one, Zach. Would this include non-ACGME neuromuscular fellowship programs as well as the ACGME?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't see why not. I mean, I think that's a great question, and there are plenty of non-ACGME accredited programs, and I would hope that those programs would agree to abide by the same timeline because they're looking at the same candidate pool.
There were a couple of questions in the chat, Zach. So one was a concern about residents not getting exposure if it's not a required rotation by the ACGME.
Yeah, that is a fantastic point. The ACGME has milestones that pertain to neuromuscular medicine. They have milestones that pertain to EMG. There's no requirement that those learning experiences are specific rotations, and there's no requirement that those rotations take place early during training. I think that is going to be a big lift to make those changes, because I think if you have this conversation at a webinar with epilepsy or have this conversation at a webinar with neuro-ophthalmology, they're going to be saying the same thing, and we all want our field to be required, but I think the ACGME has tended to be a little hands-off in terms of making those recommendations and just requiring that there are learning experiences rather than specific rotations. But I certainly agree with you. That sure would help things a lot, wouldn't it?
Another comment was, how do you think this plan affects kind of small programs? There's concerns that this gives an advantage to larger, more known programs, and that without a match, smaller programs will be at a disadvantage.
That is a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I've been trying to think about that because I think that is a question that I've seen brought up in some of the surveys. I'm trying to just understand it from a mathematical perspective. Bigger programs may have more slots, but if they are, if a program is more renowned or is more attractive to candidates, they're still going to fill with whichever candidates want to go there. So I don't think it's going to change the number of candidates that are going to be looking at or interviewing at smaller programs. I think the one situation where programs may be hurt is if you are a program that has been successful at sort of undercutting everybody else by, making people sign in August, and your program is not a good program, then they may discover when they look elsewhere that they want to go elsewhere. But I don't think that it specifically benefits smaller programs or larger programs. I think it will just give you an opportunity to sell your program for what it is and hope that you'll find somebody who's a good match.
And Zach, I might add, just in short, it will allow residents more time to explore smaller programs because they're not under pressure.
Yeah, and I think just to amplify that, I think actually this evens the playing field. I think those of us who have been in small to medium-sized programs have certainly lost potential applicants who had to sign at a prominent program due to a deadline before they could interview. And so by harmonizing the deadlines, you prevent that phenomenon from happening. So I actually think the deadline will actually prevent some of the issues that probably led to that question.
A comment that came up in the chat section that I think is also valuable and worth mentioning is that one thing we don't know in the current format is how many applicants there actually are. Basically, when you have a standardized process in which you can all the applicants enter through the same portal, we'll have a better understanding of what are the current number of people applying in neuromuscular medicine this year, and we'll be able to trend that and see how we can improve recruitment into that field. Right now, we don't have that data because we don't have a centralized process.
Exactly. I see another question in the Q&A. Will there be an online database where an applicant can view details about a program that they might not have been aware of before they apply? I think I understand that question. If you look at the current A&EM fellowship site, and I will also mention I shouldn't give the American Academy of Neurology short shrift. The AAN also has a fellowship database. I just think it's at the time not very robust. I looked at it earlier today, and I think there were only 20 neuromuscular fellowships in it. But our goal would be that one of these websites, either be one we develop de novo or the A&EM one, will have as comprehensive a list as possible that will link to programs' websites and give information about them. I think if your question is specifically about non-accredited programs, obviously the ACGME is not going to list non-accredited programs, and I don't know if the A&EM does or does not. That's something we'd have to take up with them.
Another question in the chat, Zach. What consequences, if any, do programs, large or small, that choose to not sign up to the initiative face?
So that is really the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think the consequences are going to be essentially that all of our stakeholders are going to find out that you did not agree to participate in the timeline if your program is one that does this. So how people interpret that is going to be up to them. The AAN is not going to write a letter and say, residents do not apply to these programs. They're not in the position to do that. But they are going to say, hey, here are the programs that are buying by a recommended timeline, and here are the programs that aren't. And I think that may or may not sway applicants in terms of where they choose to apply. I think it probably will, and I think it will I think that sort of public glory and shame aspect of it will probably convince more programs to agree to the recommended timeline. Certainly, if not the first year, then by the second year.
Hey, Zach, can you talk a little bit about the process of how we were envisioning as a group giving offers in that 48-hour timeline, where some programs will have 6 offers that they can give, whereas others will have 1, and how we could potentially run that so it seems fair among all the programs.
Well, if we are able to develop an application management system that does that for us, that would be great. Again, I'm not going to say that's a pipe dream, but I think that part of the application management system is probably the most aspirational of all of them, because I don't know that there is an existing system outside of a match that really does that right now. So I guess what I was envisioning would be that on July 1st, and I think we would probably set a time and have that time be noon and not what'd you say?
June 1st. You said July 1st.
I'm so sorry. June 1st. Yeah. Did I do that earlier too? Because I saw someone in the chat window said something about July. Okay. That essentially the offers would be placed by email, such that, then we would have documentation of what time the offer went out. And so you would send an offer to your top ranked candidate or whoever you want to make the offer to, and say, we'd like to invite you to participate in our fellowship. You have until this date and this time to get back to me. Please get back to me before then if you already know you're not going to. And again, if you have 1 slot, you will send that to 1 person. If you have 6 slots, you will send those to 6 people. And then as soon as you get a hit, then you are done. You do not make any more offers. If you get somebody that turns you down, you then can immediately go and make an offer to the second person on your list, etc. This is certainly a little sloppier than it would be with a match, but I think it is worlds better than what we are doing right now. And I think that is I think the point that I want to emphasize the most. There still is going to be some chaos on June 1st through June 3rd. I think we recognize that. We see that as an imperfection of this system, but it is dramatically better than people interviewing in September and being told they have 48 hours to decide before they have a chance to look anywhere else. So I think we'll learn from that. And again, we were talking before about, would this be an impetus to move for a match? And if June 1st ends up being so chaotic that we really don't like it, I think that might move the needle more towards people being comfortable with a match.
In that vein, there was a question, what is the argument against the match?
Sure. So actually, Carissa, do you want to take this one? Because I know this is something that you've had some thoughts about.
Sure. So the main arguments against the match, I think that we've kind of discussed as a group to have been the cost mostly, and the for the applicants and for the programs. For increasing the number of interviews we need to do. Once that goes back to in-person interviews, that'd be pretty substantial. And then the cost for the applicants themselves. We're trying to think of it essentially almost no cost plan, which is what the portal sort of idea was designed around, so that it could limit any kind of excessive cost. And also the fact that, for a 1-year fellowship, I think that people shouldn't be doing 15 interviews for that. They could, pick 2 to 3 programs they're interested in, and then and go ahead and go that way.
And Amanda, maybe you want to clarify what it is you're talking about in the chat?
Sure. Just in terms of thinking about the process, we are proposing something new that we would be asking residents to participate in. And so helping inform the residency program directors how to coach their residents through, sort of best practices and how to participate in the fellowship application process, out of respect for the process would probably be helpful as well, if there's not a match in particular.
That's a good idea. And then, Jaffer, do you want to talk a little bit about what we know about the movement disorders experience?
Sure, I can give a little background on the movement disorders experience. So there's approximately 50 to 60 programs nationally. When they decided to go to a match, the first year they had 20 enter the match. And so to the question about consequences that a program may face if they don't join in, the actual outcome was that within a year or 2, they actually had all 50 plus, well, not all, about 95% of the programs nationally joined in the initiative because it was so beneficial, not only to the candidates, but also to the program. So it was quite interesting. And I'll say also, during the 5 or so years that they've had the match, or the whole process, only 1 program violated the deal. And essentially all the program directors signed on to a letter to inform that program that these are the rules, and if you want to be part of the match, play by the rules, and that took care of it.
And, you know, the similar feeling is true in internal medicine, right? Internal medicine had a lot of heavy lifts to get onto a unified match cycle, and now they are very happy with the outcome. And I think we're in that process. We're in the process where we need to do some challenging maneuvering, but I think it will be long-term clearly beneficial to all parties involved.